For 11 years, a woman in Toronto prayed for a country she had never visited, and when she finally arrived, the country was already waiting for her. Her name was Isobel Kuhn, not a theologian, not a trained missionary. A girl who had, at 17, decided there was no God at all, and spent the next several years living as though she were right. She was born on December 17, 1901, in Toronto, Ontario, into a home that knew the Bible the way most homes know the weather: present, expected, occasionally inconvenient. Her father, John Kuhn, was a school teacher with gentle eyes and a steady faith. Her mother kept the house and the family and the Sunday mornings. They had little enough money that Isobel noticed, but enough love that she did not feel it. The trouble started, as it often does, with a book. At 17, she read something she could not unread, a piece of philosophy that laid out the case against God with such clean, confident logic that something in her snapped. Not gradually. Suddenly, the way a bone breaks. One moment whole, the next not. She closed the book and thought, if this is true, then nothing I have been told is true. And she chose to believe it was true. It was easier than the alternative. What followed were the years she would later describe with the kind of honesty that makes people uncomfortable. She ran toward everything her parents' faith had asked her to avoid. The parties, the attention of men who did not love her, a romance that consumed her with a kind of desperation she could not explain even to herself. A young man named Alexander, brilliant and careless, who made her feel chosen and then made her feel foolish for believing it. When he ended things, the way careless men do, without ceremony, without kindness, she came apart. She was 20 years old, alone in her room at the University of British Columbia, and for the first time in her life she considered whether any of it was worth continuing. She would write about that night later, plainly, without drama. I thought about ending it. I sat there and thought about it seriously. What stopped her was not a vision, not a voice. It was something smaller than that. A memory of her father's face and the quiet, persistent thought that if she could not disprove God, she had no right to die as though she had. It was not faith. It was a crack. But cracks, in the right hands, become doors. She went to a Bible conference the following summer only because her friend insisted, and she did not have a good enough reason to refuse. She sat in the back. She crossed her arms. She had decided to be unimpressed. Instead, a man spoke about China. He did not speak about it the way people speak about foreign things, with distance and abstraction. He spoke about specific people. A woman who had walked 3 days to hear the gospel. A village elder who had wept when he heard that God had a name. Isobel sat in the back of that conference hall in British Columbia and felt something she had not felt in 3 years. The conviction that something mattered. She went home and knelt beside her bed for the first time since she was a child. She did not know exactly who she was talking to. She said something like, "If you are real, take my life and do something with it." She did not feel anything extraordinary. She got up, went to bed, and woke up the next morning still in Toronto. But something had shifted. She applied to the China Inland Mission. They rejected her. The committee reviewed her application and found her record wanting. Her years of wandering showed. And the panel was not persuaded she had the stability a mission field required. She was told politely that she was not suitable. Most people would have accepted that verdict. Isobel had a different relationship with being told no. She reapplied. She spent the intervening year in disciplines she had never attempted before, studying scripture not because she enjoyed it yet, but because she had decided to treat faith the way she had once treated university exams, with rigorous, stubborn effort. She rose early. She kept a journal. She learned to sit with God in silence, which was harder than anything the examination committee could have asked her. She was accepted on the second application. Before she left for China, she married a man named John Kuhn, not her father, a different John entirely, one who loved both scripture and the mountains and had the rare quality of being exactly who he appeared to be. They were married simply in 1929 and sailed for China with almost nothing and no illusions about what they were heading toward. What they were heading toward was the Lisu land. The Lisu were a tribal people who lived in the canyon country of the Yunnan province in the southwest of China near the border with Burma. Deep gorges, rope bridges, mountains that made the Rockies look modest. Isobel and John trekked in on foot. The path into the canyon required crossing a river on a bridge made of bamboo and rope that swung 40 feet above white water. Isobel crossed it the first time with her eyes open because she could not decide whether closing them was braver or more foolish. The Lisu had been reached by missionaries before, barely, intermittently, and a small number had come to faith. But there was no school, no training, no way for the new believers to learn the scriptures in their own language except through a missionary who came once and left. Isobel looked at this and made a decision that everyone around her considered impractical. She would train Lisu young people to teach their own villages. She called it the Rainy Season Bible School. It ran during the months when travel was impossible, when the mountain paths turned to mud, and the rope bridges went underwater, and the canyon sealed itself off from the outside world. She would gather students, farmers' sons, young women who had never held a book, and teach them Bible, teach them to lead worship, teach them to preach in their own tongue. The first year, 6 students came. She had no textbooks. She wrote the curriculum herself by lamplight, translating concepts from English into Lisu through a translator, revising, rewriting, rising before dawn to prepare each day's teaching. John taught separately. Isobel taught the women. Some of her students could not read when they arrived. By the time they left, they could lead a service. The second year, 23 came. The third year, the room overflowed into the yard, but it was not without cost. This is what the stories always leave out. The cost is not only dramatic, it is daily. It is the child she'd lost. A baby girl born in the mountains and buried there, in soil Isobel had not chosen and could not leave. It is the malaria that came back every rainy season without asking permission. It is the loneliness of being a woman in a place where the nearest English speaker was a 2-day walk away, and even then only if the bridges held. And then came the thing that nearly broke her. In 1950, the communist forces swept into Yunnan. Missionaries were given notice, leave, or be imprisoned. Isobel and John were told they had months, at most. The Rainy Season Bible School, 12 years of it, would end. The young men and women she had trained would be left without protection, without outside help, in a country that was reclassifying Christianity as a form of foreign poison. She did not go quietly. She used every remaining month to train more people, faster, to compress years of teaching into weeks, to put into the hands of Lisu believers everything they would need to survive without her. She taught them not to need her. She taught them to be the church without a missionary present, which is the thing most missionaries are afraid to do because it makes them unnecessary. The last evening before she and John crossed the border into Burma, she gathered the students together. She did not give a rousing speech. She was not the rousing speech kind of woman. She told them what she believed, that God had not brought them this far to abandon them, that the church in the canyon would outlast the government that was trying to kill it, that she would continue to pray for them every day of her life. One of the young men, a farmer's son from the northern canyon who had come to the first Bible school, unable to read a single character, said to her through the translator, "We will not forget what you taught us. We will teach our children. They will teach theirs." She crossed the border the next morning. The border crossing itself was nearly the end. The mountain path out of Yunnan and into Burma ran through territory that the new authorities had already begun to patrol. She and John walked through the night with a small group of Lisu believers who were also fleeing. Old men, young mothers with infants, a teenage boy with a broken sandal who walked the last 3 hours bleeding from his heel without complaint. Isobel carried nothing except what fit in a single bag. She had spent 20 years arriving in a place and now she was leaving it. And she had no category for what this felt like. She would write later, "I had built something in that canyon, and I left it behind, and I did not know then whether leaving it was faithfulness or failure." Here is what she did not know when she crossed that border. The Lisu church did not die. It went underground. The young men and women she had trained, the farmers' sons, the girls who had come unable to read, the elders who had memorized whole chapters because there were no Bibles to keep, they continued to meet, secretly, in homes, in the dark. The Rainy Season Bible School had given them not a building but a structure in their minds. How to read scripture together, how to pray, how to raise up the next teacher from among themselves. When China eventually opened again, decades later, Researchers and church historians went into the Lisu Canyon to see what remained. They found a church, not the church Isobel had built. A church that had grown past anything she had designed, rooted deeper than she had known, branching into villages she had never visited. The Lisu Christians numbered in the tens of thousands. They had preserved the hymns, songs she had helped translate, sung now in mountain villages she had never entered. They had kept the faith not because a foreign missionary maintained it for them, but because she had refused to let them need her. Isobel Kuhn never returned to China. She came back to North America, to Vancouver, and then, because she could not stop working, she began to write. 12 books in the last decade of her life, all of them accounts of what had happened in the canyon. All of them told with the same unsentimental clarity she had brought to her teaching. She wrote for the church. She wrote for young women who were considering the mission field and needed to know what it actually cost. She did not romanticize it. She described the baby buried in the mountain soil. She described the loneliness. She described the crossing of the bridge with her eyes open because she could not decide whether to close them. In 1954, she was diagnosed with cancer. She kept writing. Her friends urged her to rest. She said she had things left to say and a limited amount of time to say them. This was not bravado. It was the same stubborn practicality she had brought to everything. There were Lisu young men and women in her memory who had arrived unable to read and left able to preach, and if she had managed to accomplish that in a canyon in Yunnan with a handwritten curriculum and a kerosene lamp, she was not going to stop now because her body was failing. She finished her last book 9 days before she died. Isobel Kuhn died on March 20, 1957 in Monterey, California, at 55 years old. She had spent less than 30 years in active ministry. She had trained hundreds of Lisu teachers directly. She had helped build a church that would outlive the government that tried to erase it, outlive the missionary organization that sent her, outlive her own ability to be present. She had begun as a girl in Toronto who decided there was no God. She had ended as a woman who trusted him enough to walk away from everything she had built and leave it in the hands of the people she had taught. One historian, writing about the Lisu Church decades after her death, noted something that stopped him when he wrote it. The church she left behind did not call itself her legacy. They called themselves simply believers. The way a church should. The last entry in her journal, written when she could barely hold a pen, was a verse she had carried since the conference in British Columbia, where a man had spoken about a woman who walked 3 days to hear the gospel. It was from the book of Isaiah. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. She had waited. She had been renewed. She had renewed others. The canyon is still there. The rope bridges have been replaced by steel cables now. But on Sunday mornings, in villages along the gorge that Isobel Kuhn never entered, people gather. They sing in Lisu. They read from scriptures translated into a language that had no written form until missionaries arrived and built one. They pray for each other, and for their children, and for nations they have never visited. They do not know her name, some of them. They are, nonetheless, her answer. So here is the question this story leaves behind. Not a comfortable one, but a real one. What are you building that is meant to outlast you? What are you teaching right now that does not depend on you being present to hold it together? The test of real work is not whether it survives while you are watching. It is whether it survives when you walk away. Isobel Kuhn walked away into Burma on a mountain path in the dark, bleeding feet behind her, her whole life's work left in the canyon below. It survived. If this story moved you, if something in Isobel's life spoke to something in yours, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Gathering of Souls for more stories like this one. Lives that cost something, faith that was tested in the dark, and the unexpected ways God builds things that last. Next week, a man who was handed an impossible assignment in a country that didn't want him, and who stayed anyway for 40 years, until the country changed its mind. You won't want to miss it.